We've got Frederik Rosen from the Nordic Centre for Cultural Heritage and Armed Conflict, who's going to give us a talk called Being Between a Rock and the Soul, the Moral Riddle of Cultural Property in War. So take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you to Eric and Helen for organizing this workshop and inviting me, and also for dragging me into these more philosophical discussions about the role and faith of cultural property in our context today. So I have a political science background. I'm talking a lot about political theory, but my entrance to this field has mainly been through working with international organizations, namely NATO, on issues related to policy, capacity, and doctrines for accommodating proper measures for protecting, safeguarding, or handling challenges related to cultural property in armed conflict. So even if I now try to pitch this paper, closer. Oh, this is better, huh? Okay, very good. Sorry. So I guess this is also an attempt to kind of pitch some of the challenges and riddles that we have been confronted with on kind of more practical operational issues with regard to translating the 54 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict into institutional capacities and doctrinal guidelines and directives for making this regime operational. And this is kind of how it goes. I mean, the perspective I'll start with is that at least during the last 100 years, we have seen how cultural property has become a growing issue in armed conflicts. In parallel to this development, we are also seeing a growth in international norms, laws, and state practice, recognizing the intrinsic value of cultural property. And altogether, we may observe how the 20th century's proliferation of laws and norms indicated a heartfelt and growing societal interest in an issue which scholars argue is as old as war itself. So we thus have plenty of historical and recent inroads and reasons for elaborating a perspective on the morality of targeting or destroying cultural property in war. Yet, the family of conversations forming the field of just war theory, for some reason, only very recently started to take an interest in the ethics of cultural property, destruction, and protection. How come? Why is it that the just war theory tradition, including its most recent branches, has omitted an issue otherwise enjoying enormous attention in international law, policy, and among the general public? How come that we don't see a literature within moral philosophy on these issues when so many other aspects of harm to civilians and soldiers are covered? And that question should be the topic of my talk here. And to seek an answer to it, I'll first identify 5 explanations for why just war theory, historically as well as contemporary, have omitted cultural property from their repertoire of moral dilemmas, and then move on to unpack some of these explanations. The first reason I will give is observation that cultural property, and I use the concept of cultural property interchangeable with cultural heritage, because this is how we also do it in the policy world today, but also employing the concept of cultural property to emphasize that what we're talking about here today is mainly material objects. But the first reason I'll give is the observation that cultural property as a moral object is no easy fit for the just war theory tradition. And why is that? Now, the just war theory tradition stands on 2 pillars: a notion of the human being and the universal value and undividable value, and their universal and undividable value. And, on the other hand, a general moral principle against inflicting death and suffering on human beings. And standing on these 2 pillars, just war theory sets out to explore under which exceptional circumstances war may create a moral necessity to override the general principle against killing, inflicting harm, or risking the lives of soldiers or civilians. And whatever military necessity applies, these 2 pillars remain as a substructure of identifying moral dilemmas and theorizing about them. And without them, just war theory would lose its ground for elaborating general observations from particular cases. And we may here assume a certain reluctance among scholars towards exchanging the familiar just war theory object, the human being and its body, with an inherently ill-defined and unstable object such as cultural property, as this immediately raises complex questions also about the foundation of just war theory. And I'll get back to this later in my talk. The second reason I see is this general attitude that human life cannot be weighed against cultural property because the value of human life always stands above things. And consequently, the conventional just war theory dilemmas about killing in self-defense or risking the life of soldiers to save the nation or civilians do not apply. In other words, the incommensurability between cultural property and the human body, the apple and pear quality, prevent us from viewing them as part of the same moral system, an attitude which stamps out the possible moral ember of cultural property before it sparks any life and death dilemmas. The reason number 3 is that while belligerent destructions of what we call cultural property, what we today call cultural property, runs as deep as war itself, the concept of cultural property and its normative, institutional, and legal frameworks are very much a modern phenomenon, which proliferated during the 20th century. Occasionally, the fathers of just war theory, including Jakob Pliluski, Hugo Grotius, and Emer de Vattel, they did mention cultural heritage in their writings, and contemporary scholars of the topic often tag these names to add historical depth to the topic. Yet, in reality, the mention is very taciturn. We see no elaborations of moral dilemmas or standards like we see with the question related to, for instance, the moral implications of killing enemy soldiers, targeting non-combatants, and the right to wage war in self-defense. In fact, before the 1954 Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict, we had no agreed concept about the legal category of objects that came to be known as cultural property. Not before the 54 Convention did we get a definition of cultural property that grouped places of worship, archaeological areas, graveyards, and paintings within the same category of objects. And not before much later did we get a concept of world heritage as defined in the Convention concerning the protection of the world's cultural and natural heritage, which was adopted in 1972. The law, so to say, came before a shared definition of the objects of concern. The law constituted cultural property as a possible moral object in war. This is what lawyers call progressive lawmaking, compared to a codification of already existing norms. Fourthly, moving back even further to the Bible, the key driver of early just war theory, we see no inroads for viewing the destruction of cultural property as a moral dilemma. Yes, the biblical texts are full of historical and sacred places that today would qualify as what we call cultural property, and they thematize collective emotional attachments to these as well. The most famous being the story of the golden calf, the model allegory of iconoclasm in the Abrahamic religions. Cases of biblical destruction of places of worship includes also Solomon's temple. However, the Bible contains, to my knowledge at least, no thematization of guilt or liability arising out of demolishing sacred places and icons. Rather, the biblical narrative actually suggests the moral right in sometimes destroying objects we today, from the perspective of international law, may identify as cultural property, like the destruction of sacred idols in the fable of the golden calf. This lack of thematization indicates to me that what we today consider cultural property crimes historically did not stir up questions about sin and guilt and whether the soul of a perpetrator would go to heaven or hell after death. It did not, like killing, call for considerations about morality. And this may explain why the early just war theories, theologians, thinkers, scholars, or whatever you want to call them, omitted destruction of cultural objects in their theoretical repertoire. A fifth reason, we have few, if any, historical examples of wars started by disputes or being fought over cultural heritage. And we have a limited number of examples where military forces have been engaged with the sole purpose of conquering or protecting cultural heritage. And military rules of engagement seldom sanction the use of armed force to protect cultural heritage. The current difficulty of the heritage community to convince defense organizations about the relevance of adopting policy doctrine and capacity on cultural property indicates the topic's low priority in the context of war fighting. Combat, and thus a human self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of others, rarely spring from cultural property issues. On the battlefield, historically as well as today, cultural property never gave rise to the kind of moral dilemmas that commanders face on an everyday basis when it comes to weighing the loss of human lives against military objectives. Okay, I think that these 5 reasons may offer some explanation as to why just war theory never embarked on discussing cultural property as a moral issue of warfare. And I would, of course, be curious to hear from you if we should add additional reasons here. Now, I should like to say a little bit more about cultural property destruction in war as a modern phenomenon. And my point is that while it's a historical fact that belligerents' destruction of what we today call cultural property run as deep as war itself, our concept of cultural property and its normative, institutional, and legal framework is very much a modern phenomenon. Or maybe we should put it like this. While the value of cultural property and its moral dimensions in the context of war do have historical seeds, these seeds did not grow into trees before the 20th century. As I've argued elsewhere, the drivers of this development has been the 20th century growth of norms, laws, and institutions related to cultural property, combined with the recent rise of identity-driven, asymmetric, urbanized, hybridized, and globalized conflicts, which together have fundamentally altered the global politics of cultural property in armed conflict. If I'm right in this, we may further conclude that the questions of the ethics of cultural property in war, as we speak about it today, is a new topic not only for just war theory, but also a new topic in itself. And this presents us, I'll argue, with some intricate challenges with regard to aligning the topic of cultural property with just war theory. Now, cultural property is not the only new issue for just war theory. And just war theory, and namely its recent revisionist position, has identified and theorized about a range of new moral questions produced by changes in warfare and weapon technologies. The argument for revising traditional just war theory is that its standard scheme has difficulties with accommodating moral reflections on, for instance, hybrid and asymmetric warfare, new weapon technologies such as lethal autonomous weapon system and drones, cyber and information warfare on social media, and another recent topic of just war theory, which is the natural environment, including also cultural landscapes. I will not here examine these new topics, but merely notice that compared to them, cultural property stands apart in several ways. Firstly, it's a category of objects clearly defined and regulated by the laws of armed conflict. Secondly, when identified by international law, these objects are physically, clearly demarcated and specifiable objects with relatively clear parameters for deciding when they have been damaged or destroyed. And thirdly, damage and destruction of such objects entails, and this is important, in itself no direct effects to the physical well-being of individuals. The body is, so to say, not an issue, nor is the immediate stability of society or other living creatures or fauna. If direct physical effects to the body or societal destabilization is generated by attacks on cultural property, it is because objects included critical infrastructure functions, for instance, a historical building hosting a hospital, a stock market, computer servers, or the like, or because its destruction or the way it happened produced fear and anxiety. However, at least from a legal perspective, these dimensions need to be kept separate from the questions related to cultural property, as they fall under critical infrastructure issues and terror towards populations. So my point is that compared to other recent development in just war theory, cultural property stands apart and requires separate attention. Then what happens when we install cultural property as a new object of just war theory? So we get questions like, when may cultural property be legitimately targeted? What kind of necessity must exist compared to the value of the cultural property in question? Under what circumstances would it be permissible to risk soldiers' lives to safeguard cultural property? How do we weigh cultural property protection against other forms of protection? Should states expect the soldiers to take additional risk or risk civilian lives to protect cultural property? Is it morally legitimate to kill someone who destroys cultural property? What happens is, as I see it, that we first of all face a set of interrelated challenges that I will identify as, firstly, the falseness of the Apple and Pierce account. 2, the layers of value challenge. 3, the local ownership paradigm. And 4, the lack of a victimology for cultural property crimes. At the most fundamental level, the challenge for developing a just war theory on cultural property question is, I will argue, not about the difficulty of weighing apples, human lives, against peers, cultural property. Rather, it's about expanding a tradition of theorizing that stands on fairly stable ontological ground, which is the indivisible human body, to a set of objects which theoretically viewed appear fundamentally unstable. My point is that when it comes to cultural property, we don't even have a peer to weigh against our human body, Apple. The issue lies, I will argue, at the ontological level. As I mentioned before, just war theory stands on a very strong tradition for viewing the subject as indivisible, be it in the eyes of God, Immanuel Kant, or the liberal human rights regime. As put by Graham Parson, a professor at West Point, the theory of discrimination in just war theory is derived from a theory of justice that places the value of the private individual above that of political society. As another scholar puts it, non-combatant immunity remains a core value of just war theory, perhaps even the core value. Wherever and whoever these non-combatants are, we may add. And the same may be said about the status of soldiers, as one main task of just war theory is also to identify the threshold where military necessity overrides soldiers' right to life. That is, when may soldiers kill soldiers? When may commanders risk the soldier's life to protect, for instance, cultural property? And this ontological position provides a bedrock for just war theory. It organizes the theoretical system and enables commensurability. It makes it possible to weigh combatant and civilian lives against each other across the globe. It makes it possible to theorize about what kind of situations necessity may override the equal right to life. And it makes it possible to elaborate paradigmatic dilemmas and solutions that may be applied to situations across time and space. All this without first clarifying in what ways a fundamental commensurability applies to the level of its agent and object of concern, which is the human beings. Now, the inversion of the equal value of life position would be to put the value of politics over the individual, a position we associate with the hallmarks of fascism. Just war theory cannot endure that. Injecting a fascist notion of the individual would explode the theoretical template, as any consideration of moral agency and wrongs would require an assessment on a case-by-case basis of the value of each individual life. And such assessment would require a general clarification of how to calculate such a value. In the lack of a practical theory for the visibility of the value of human life, just war theory would be all at sea. In addition, while standing on firm ground with regard to a shared concept of the indivisibility of the value of human life as such, just war theory and the laws of war alike struggle with coming to terms with the application of the principle of distinction. The question is what kind of agency that counters participation in hostilities and thus removes non-combatant immunity, if applicable. But cultural property is not in and of itself a right beyond object, such as the human body. Rather, its definition rests on an ascribed value and its use by human beings. And therefore, it derives its status not from being as such, but from the agency of human beings. Furthermore, the concept of cultural property, which we should remember is first of all a concept of international law, is a name that refers to a very wide range of objects and places, including historical monuments, museums, archaeological sites, and historical buildings. Adding to the challenges, the object identified by international law may not be the only object in war that interpolates our moral universe due to the cultural value that was identified by the laws of war. Because if we move, and here I'm thinking about the 1977 additional protocol to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which ascribes also protection to places of worship, covering not only churches and mosques, but also cemeteries, holy trees, and so on and so forth. Now, within each of these general categories, the variety of particular objects and sites is simply innumerable and highly dividable, a stark contrast to just war theory's concept of human being and its body. And the concept of cultural property, I think, merely states that certain specially valued sites and movable and immovable objects enjoys protection, but it says nothing about how to establish such a value. There's no procedural steps in international law for identifying cultural property apart from nomination for World Heritage lists. And altogether, the international legal concept of cultural property is fundamentally heterogeneous. The ontology of cultural property refers to collective sentiments and emotions. That's where cultural property derives its being from. From the perspective of moral philosophy, it may be questioned whether the legal concept of cultural property provides sufficient conceptual ground for moral reasoning. Just as law does not make a moral right, law does not create objects with a moral value. The only thing the concept of cultural property seems to do for moral philosophy is to establish a link to a theme in international law and its related debates. Theoretically speaking, we may view the concept of cultural property as referring not to objects as sight, but to the layer of additional immaterial value that human beings add to certain sites and objects. Could be civilian as well as military. Normative attitudes and value sentiments, and that is emotions, form this extra value that constitute cultural property. As no universally applicable parameters exist for establishing this value, this weighing must depend on a practical assessment of each concrete situation. And that brings us to the tension between the assumed universal value of cultural property and the local ownership paradigm. The universal value of cultural property is an established norm which is all over UNESCO's policies and conventions. On the other hand, we also find a burgeoning debate about the difficulties, if not impossibility, of defining the value of object constituted by how particular individuals and communities ascribe values to these objects. As UNESCO member states count many former colonial countries, we have in recent years seen a pushback with regard to UNESCO's traditionally very Western approach to cultural heritage. We have also seen an increasing critique from the academic community and commentators alike of the notion of a universal cultural heritage. The debates about the value of cultural property thus oscillate between universal value and decreasing insistence on local ownership. The definition of what counts as cultural property has become, as we have already noticed, highly contested ground. And adding to these difficulties, of the range of objects relevant for just war theory, if we go by the legal definition in the 54 Convention, only a few of them hold the status as recognized UNESCO World Heritage Sites. The drafters of the 54 Convention did a great job in bridging the universal and the particular by stating in the Convention's preamble that being convinced that damage to cultural property belonging to any people whatsoever means damage to the cultural heritage of all mankind, since each people makes its contribution to the culture of the world. In other words, that the sum of local heritage of any people adds up to a universal heritage of mankind. However, for military officers and just war scholars, this does not help identifying the objects of concern, cultural property, that according to the definition in the 54 Convention interpolates our moral universes. The Convention obliges member states to elaborate inventories over national cultural property, as well as marking it for the purpose of ensuring protection. Again, such lists may be political in nature and can therefore indicate, but not substantiate, the moral value of cultural property for the purpose of theorizing the moral status in war. A main argument in the field of heritage studies is that identifying cultural property is a cultural act in itself, and the principle of local ownership must apply to any identification. From the perspective of the 1954 Convention, and even if UNESCO and the international community at first sight see no value in, say, a stone in a remote valley in Afghanistan, that stone may qualify as a piece of cultural property if the stone functions as, say, an important reference for local mythology. Yet no theory enables us to schematize a priori these objects for the purpose of classifying cultural property according to the different value. We cannot spot them from in the air, so to say. And that is just another way of saying that what we speak about here today is not material objects as such, but collective emotions, and how collective emotions fit into just war theory. Therefore, the necessary philosophical exercise is not to come up with a general formula for identifying cultural property, but to identify who defines cultural property. Defining cultural property cannot build on abstraction, but must depend on empirical exercises. And therefore, the only way to approximate a value would be empirical, through comprehensive ethnographic fieldwork. And this means that before contemplating on proportionality and necessity, just war scholars need to go to the field and conduct longest ethnographic field studies of the particular sites of object in question, as the Stockholm Center of Just War Theory here have embarked on. The difficulties do not end with issues of identification and commensurability, unfortunately. For intended destruction to be considered a moral problem, it is not enough that we ascribe value to the object. We also need to know the consequences of losing cultural property. A group may believe that the destruction of an object means the end of the world, and therefore consider its protection an entirely valid reason to start a war and sacrifice all the daughters and sons in one last battle. And they may lose the object only to see the sun rise again, as if nothing happened. We know how inventive humans are, and that religious cults throughout time and place worked out rituals around substitutes for the real thing. The loss of an object may be remedied by reconstructing it or replacing it by something else. Therefore, to equal the supposed value of an object with the supposed harm of losing that object seems problematic. Just because a group feels something does not make it a moral right. The question is what kind of harm and injury we see when cultural property is destroyed. What kind of human consequences flows from the destruction of cultural property? Who gets hurt and where and when? I add the when to open the question of short and long-term consequences, and the where to emphasize the supposed transnational consequences of destroying cultural property. Now, long-term consequences constitute a really tricky issue within the laws of armed conflict. In fact, the laws regulating the use of armed force inclusively considers immediate harm arising from the immediate combat situation. The rationale for omitting the long-term consequences is to preclude arguments of military necessity within proportionality equation aiming at some distant future goal. In other words, to disallow collateral damage estimation at the highest strategic level, because this would practically be unmanageable from the perspective of law and therefore weaken the legal protection of soldiers and civilians. Now, The loss of arms conflicts disregard of long-term strategic objective should of course not prevent just war theory to include a long-term perspective in the moral consideration of cultural property destruction and protection in war. Actually, the case of cultural property forces just war theory into a long-term perspective because the norms and rules against destroying cultural property exclusively stands on a long-term perspective. They take no interest in, for instance, the destruction of cultural property to inflict instant terror in the hearts and minds of civilians. Terror campaigns and the harm they aspire to inflict fall under a different set of legal and moral issues than normally associated with the question of cultural property. The best example may be taken from debates about the possible roles of cultural property destruction in relation to genocide and ethnic cleansing, and the question of whether systematic destruction of cultural property could be considered an act of cultural cleansing, whether or not accompanied by atrocities to humans. The international community, in fact, almost included such systematic attacks on cultural property in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide from 1948. The associated term cultural cleansing was recently foregrounded in the international community as UNESCO used it to describe Daesh's destruction of cultural property in Iraq and Syria. And history do reveal that systematic destruction of cultural property often accompany mass destruction, mass atrocities, including ethnic cleansing and genocide. The instant terror effects of such acts should not confuse the kind of harm we consider here. Little systematic knowledge exists about the consequences to individuals and communities of losing cultural property. No studies has yet, in a systematic manner, assessed the consequences of such destruction. And this means that we can only speculate about the consequences of losing cultural property, and thus of the moral consequences of destroying it. Still, the idea of cultures and cultural groups' dependency on the material anchorage in the kind of cultural reference object that international law categorizes as cultural property stands tremendously strong. And so does the idea that cultures and cultural groups may decompose if they lose this anchorage. But such decomposing is not an instant result of a combat situation or a destruction campaign. It's a creeping and long-term effect on collective sentiments, emotions, and social cohesion created by the loss of communal reference object. An assessment of such effect would also need to take into account culture as a constantly evolving process affected by all kinds of things. The question is, how could such effect ever be measured and inserted into the kind of dilemmas and schemes operated by just war theory? If we don't know the consequences of losing cultural property, how can we discuss proportionality issues? Okay, so to conclude my little intervention here, compared to human life, which from a literal standpoint appears as a consistent object across time and space, cultural property is a piece of wet soap. We see it, but when we try to catch it and pin down its value, it tends to slip away. No general examples exist. We simply cannot elaborate a deontological position on cultural property. That would go against dominant international norms. So, from a just war theory perspective, we therefore lack a clear object to insert in the matrix of distinction, necessity, proportionality, precaution, and so on. And most importantly, we lack a victimology. The lack of a victimology of crimes against cultural property means that after they have done the meticulous fieldwork to weigh the value of a given object, just war scholars also need to sort out the possible long-term effects of its destruction. Not before both aspects has been established will it be possible to theorize in any meaningful manner about necessity and proportionality with regard to taking or risking lives to protect cultural property. We are therefore, I think, presented with a baby in the bathing water problem. Should we decline to discuss the moral implication of intentionally destroying or protecting cultural property in armed conflict because of conceptual and practical problems? Because we do agree that we see a baby. While cultural property is a fundamentally heterogeneous concept and essentially contested from a political perspective, And the process for identifying the value constituting cultural property also is essentially contested. There is a general agreement that there is cultural property, and that it matters greatly to people. To deny the relevance of reflecting, or even just to claim the impossibility of reflecting on moral implications of targeting, destroying, or protecting cultural property in war, would be to refuse that cultural property has a value. And that would furthermore call for arguments against a comprehensive norm development with regard to cultural property and the idea that cultural property constitutes a moral category. So I admit that I have deconstructed rather than pointed out a viable avenue for exploring a just war theory perspective on cultural property. But doing so, I've also pointed out some of the real and practical difficulties that I have seen with operationalizing international law applicable to the protection of cultural property in times of armed conflict. It's not only because it's difficult to pronounce the word cultural property, which constantly twists my tongue, that we lack a proper implementation of 1954 regime. It's because of the unclarity that I have tried to schematize in this paper. Because one of the reasons why states remain disinclined to invest in implementation, it seems to be the difficulty of identifying in a clear and concise manner what we speak about when we speak about cultural property, who the victims are, and the consequences of losing cultural property, and thus what kind of bang for the buck the state gets for funding initiatives that seeks to create better protection mechanisms for cultural property in armed conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have some questions. Let's start, Gerald, and then...
Thanks, Frederik. That's very interesting, and so I don't deny that this is comparatively new work, and there seems to be a lacuna in just war theory. But just to kind of, I just wanted to make a note. This isn't meant to be a challenge to what you said, but it's meant to be a kind of possible source of assistance. But I mean, traditional just war theory, it doesn't just deal with a sort of interhuman conflicts. It can't do it because the paradigmatic just cause is territorial aggression. So it's not just human beings, it's human beings in a certain territory that's being attacked. So however the evaluative sums come out, it looks as though there has to be some accommodation of and provision for the disvalue of being attacked in that territory. So there's a kind of there's a puzzle case in just war theory. Let's say you had reasonable assurance, right? This is a condition that's probably very rarely been fulfilled in history. But let's say you had reasonable assurance that the invasion could be bloodless, right? So it's bloody because you put up resistance to it. But if you just capitulated, it would be bloodless. So as I say, in history, that it would be naive to think that kind of those conditions have ever been met, because how can you really trust the people who are swarming in over your borders with weapons and heavy boots? But nonetheless, that is a kind of puzzle case. So however just war theory deals with that, it looks as though it's invested in a project that gives us permission to put up resistance, even though were you to capitulate, because it's just, territory, as it were, you're ceding to other people who will then claim authority, there wouldn't be resistance. So but that doesn't kind of give us any very sharp materials for talking about cultural property in particular, but it does inform us that whatever the mix of elements is in just war theory, it simply does include non-human elements, namely the value of territory occupied.
That's interesting, and I didn't think of the territory thing. one avenue that also could be interesting exploring there is how the nation and the territory historically has been viewed under the nation as a person, kind of a metaphor. You find that very clearly in Machiavelli, for instance, right? So that the attack on the nation would be metaphorically viewed an attack on a metaphysical body, and that needs to be explored. Yeah.
Yeah, so, you're right. I mean, you're right, and this is complicated because it's been analysed in different ways, and you can personify states, territories, but presumably there's a kind of more prosaic way of looking at this stuff. We're just, we're here, we live here, we're entitled to put up a resistance, and somehow some proportionality calculations must be sort of sandwiched in there in order to make sense of that. But again, I'm not saying that much explicit attention has been paid to that, but implicitly it's there. It must have been there, because otherwise it just wouldn't give us permission to repel invaders.
And another note, that's the relationship between sovereignty and property rights, which kind of pops up as a relevant theme there. Yeah.
Okay, I think Helen had a thing on this.
So a quick thought on this. I mean, I don't know. So one way to cash this out, Gerald, is this sort of saying these are, because just war theories traditionally incorporated defense of sovereignty as a just cause for war, therefore it must be incorporating what you called non-human elements. But I guess the sort of the thrust of the more recent revisionist view is that they're not harms to life and limb, but they can still be cashed out in terms of harm to individuals, right? So it's still very much a kind of human harm, right? But it's sort of harm to your political rights and so on, right? So rights of self-determination in terms of your individual freedoms. So, and I think in a way it's tempting to think, look, surely just war theory kind of should be able to quite easily accommodate cultural property because it already incorporates things like political values, which are kind of more abstract than your kind of, life and limb type harms. But I also think that's a bit of an illusion because sovereignty has a clear functional role that it plays, right? It has a protective role, at least when it's working properly, that it kind of serves to enable individuals to go about their lives in a kind of reasonably safe way and construct the common life and so on in sort of Walserian terms. Cultural property doesn't really do that, right? It doesn't have a protective function. It's a thing you produce when you're in conditions of relative security, right? It's the upshot of having these rights. But it doesn't follow that the upshot inherits the value of the freedoms to produce these things. Right? So it's just a sort of distinction between the fact that I'm free to make pottery and express myself in my art is very important. It would be bad to stop me from trying to create art. But that doesn't mean that my pot inherits that value, right? That I could use a lot of force if you tried to interfere with me in ways that stopped me from expressing myself and engaging in creative activities. But I couldn't do, my pots are going to be crap, let's be honest. So, the idea that I could use serious force to protect the pot just doesn't follow. So I think Gerald's right that you're giving a very simplistic idea of what just war theory is about that's not helpful when we're trying to think about how to sort of slot cultural heritage in. But also I don't think it's easy, right? I think the way in which we should most plausibly think about the value of sovereignty doesn't give us a helpful way to think about cultural property necessarily.
Two finger on that could also be that sovereignty is a biblical theme. So you have book 1 and 2 of Samuel and the divine kingdom and all these kind of things. So you have a biblical theme. So that's I'm also trying to answer the question, why is it? If this is a topic that really is important, why didn't moral philosophy pick up on it? And that's why I try to understand, right?
Yeah, I mean, in a way that seemed like an odd aspect of the paper to me, because on the one hand you've got this kind of, that's just an empirical question, why haven't philosophers done X? And then it wasn't clear to me how much light that was shedding on the philosophical questions, right? So there could be all kinds of reasons of why people haven't studied something. It's not clear, I think it would be good to pull out more why you think that matters for helping us understand how to solve these questions.
Yeah.
Because the sort of historical explanation of why someone hasn't studied X might have no bearing on X at all. So I thought it would be good to kind of show more in the paper about why it matters, why we've got this sort of backstory.
Helen, you were next
Oh,
on the
sorry,
list.
sorry.
Yeah.
Can you say, I don't know what you mean by the indivisibility of the value of human life. You said this is like the pillar of just war theory. I don't know what that is.
So, the fact that we assume an equality of human life as the bedrock.
What does indivisibility?
That the value of your life and my life is equal, independent of who we are, where we come from, how we look like, what race we are, and so on and so forth.
But not independently.
So it's just a kind of a liberal, kind of a right regime
Right.
approach.
But the central view of kind of, say, even Waltzerian just war theory, and certainly more recent just war theory, is that I can forfeit my right to life, right?
Is what?
I can forfeit my right to life. So the idea that we're all kind of on this sort of moral plane is rejected by just war theory. So I'm worried that when you say something like the indivisibility of the value of human life, you're sort of taking it for granted that everybody's life matters equally, and then what you said was that we get this kind of, the second pillar is that sometimes we can override that value, and that's what gets war off the ground as a permissible project. That's true of things like harms to civilians, where on the traditional view, the civilians retain their normal rights against being harmed, and so then you need to override those rights. But it's not considered true by Walzer or McMahon or anybody sort of working in sort of more recent literature about combatants, right? Because combatants forfeit their rights against being harmed. So the liable people, you don't have an overriding justification. These people, their rights to life are quite different to the rights to life of other people. So I think framing this as indivisibility of the value of human life is very misleading, because it suggests that no matter what, everybody's on a par, and that's not an accurate reflection of just war theory.
Isn't it? That's what I got from browsing over it. And I thought, because what you're pointing is kind of an agent-agency relationship. So it's actually the agency that kind of mediates the rights of combatants, civilians, and so on and so forth. But with reference to a fundamental, indivisible right as a human being, as an agent. So, but otherwise you would have a racist concept, right? Or what would you base the different value of life on?
It's based, so the idea is that I can forfeit my rights in virtue of things that I do. So if that's what you mean by
That's
agency.
yeah.
So the thought is something like, this then gives us different moral status, right? So so you can say on the one hand something like, human beings all have value, right? That's not of a special interest to just war theorists, because we're interested in who can we harm in war, right? And so the way in which just war theorists have answered that question is by looking at the comparative strengths of people's rights. And the traditional view has been that civilians retain their normal rights, which are very stringent, but combatants lack those normal rights. Given that that's where the real work is being done in terms of just war theory, about answering the crucial question of who you're permitted to harm, it's not clear why we would think this sort of background question, that there's a sort of assumption that people have value, is of particular. It's certainly not the bedrock of just war theory, right? That's the kind of just war theory sort of, sure, we all start off with the same rights, but then what happens in war is that some people lose their rights. And that's the kind of starting point for the just war theorists, I would say.
But to speak about losing rights, you need to start somewhere from.
Sure, right.
So what is it that they lose then?
Say, right not to be harmed.
And does that right not to be harmed apply to all people before they actually
Right, so
enter the
the
agency?
thought is something like...
So there's an equal right.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're saying the same basically. So you're assuming that beyond agency, because combatants and civilians, that's agency categories. That depends on what you do, what you say, what clothes you wear, whether you pick up an arms or not, right? But before that, I mean, it's a kind of a naked body approach, right? Before politics.
Right. I mean, my point is simply that by calling it the indivisibility, you suggest that this is a kind of, that we have persistent equal rights against harm throughout time. That's denied by the just. Well, then it can't be persistent throughout time.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying just then there is an equality of value of human life, which is a departure for then assessing exceptional circumstances where, taking up an arms could override that fundamental right. Because a right can be, it's about derogation, right? Isn't it?
There's probably other people on the list.
Yeah, sure. Next we have Bashar.
More on the discussion by Rosen and Helen. This idea of comparing cultural artifacts, cultural heritage, human life, is definitely there outside the context of war. We allocate resources to protecting cultural heritage and collecting it versus allocating it to health service. In that sense, we are giving weights, so we can divert the resources. That's one way of comparing. So it's not, or we do have some level of assessment of value of these things outside the context of war. So that's one. It's not a unique thing in that sense, and we do it all the time, apparently. Of course, not in the context of causing harm, in the context of preventing harm or promoting certain good. So we have this kind of outside. So the question is why we haven't had this kind of comparison already, having some kind of substantial history with it. The second thing is about this idea of harm to human life versus to sovereignty versus to other things. Of course, if we want to discuss cultural heritage as something valuable, it must be valuable for humans. We're assuming that. Because some people might think otherwise about other things like the environment. With cultural property, it must be something related to the humans. Now, the question is the kind of thing that can justify war. Such as sovereignty. Of course, defending life is also defending sovereignty, which is choice. The question is whether cultural properties can fit within that choice of what one. In the sense that sometimes even justified grounds for war, which is annexation of the territory, without expelling the people from it. They neither die nor lose the territory. They exchange the state. And you might even be annexed by a democratic country, which gives you full citizenship. And like this democracy, you might say, no, I don't want that, I defend my independence. That would be not even at the level of doing what you want to do. It's a kind of symbolic thing. And therefore, that would be kind of justification. If it is a justification for war, one might say, no, if another democratic state comes and invade you and take and keep you there and just change it, you have no right to of self-defense in this case. Of course, I think international law suggests that we do. I'm not so sure about moral theory, but that seems to be the common intuition that you have the right, even though there isn't really a change. So that can you fit cultural properties within some of these categories that are not about your daily liberal choice of what profession you take, nor about democracy, but about kind of symbolic attachment of some sort that is worth defending, as it seems that in a certain context of justified self-defense. So these are just remarks on see what.
I'm just aware. So my question is not so much whether harm to or threats to cultural property could legitimize military operations or be a permissible ground for launching cross-border attacks. I'm just saying that we see very few cases where this has been the issue. I'm aware of one, I think, where Turkey raided into Syria in order to save a saint, and ran back with the saint, and that was a kind of a naval operation. But otherwise, I'm aware of very few examples. We haven't been able to find. I mean, part of the work that I'm doing with that I've been doing with NATO was exactly to come up with examples for best practice. I mean, how has this issue played out in recent wars as well as historical wars? And while cultural property definitely had an impact on the decision-making processes, and also had it, for instance, for the air campaigns against Daesh in Syria and Iraq, it's not something that's been forefronted. So it hasn't really triggered moral discussions about life and death, about creating suffering to human beings, or risking soldiers, or risking taxpayers' money, and all these other considerations that are in play when states and defense organizations take their decisions. And because it has not been that, it hasn't, created so much a pull from the defense organizations and states alike to commission papers from, let's say, the philosophical and theoretical establishment to provide them with reflections on kind of a more metaphysical and abstract issues related to the use of force vis-a-vis protection or destruction of cultural property in war. So this is why I kind of give this as one of the explanations for why we perhaps not have seen this topic come on. But as Helen said, there's all kind of reasons for why topics are not bubbling up in the academia. But one of the reasons why they bubble up is a pull from the political establishment. And we could also go into the whole kind of the institutional placement of the 1954 Convention, and how making UNESCO and thus the cultural ministries of the custodians of the convention, and thereby freeing it or letting defense ministries and defense organizations go when it comes to responsibility of implementing the convention. At least this is how the regime has worked in practice. Also has not created this kind of pull for the defense organization to find out how should we deal with this issue. I mean, so yeah, I think that's one of the key reasons why we haven't seen it
is there an agreement with the idea that investigating anthropological side of that value is important to addressing proportionality more accurately, because the proportionality question poses on us some kind of a concrete answer sometimes, or at least semi-concrete answer to these values. So I agree that there needs to be further investigation of the nature of the value.
But also, I mean, it's also significant. I mean, this lack of victimology. I mean, we do need a systematic assessment of what kind of harm we see when we see cultural property destruction. And I have encountered that problem in very, very concretely, because you can elaborate all the concepts, and the cause is good in itself. I mean, saving the world heritage of mankind and so on and so forth. It sounds very good. But as soon as you get to the level of the decision makers that are able actually to pull the triggers on funding and to set the agenda for defense organizations, they want to see the proof. So where's the proof? I mean, we like the thing, we like the deal. Tell me, where can I find the facts? The same with the financing of terrorism agenda, which also was in many ways flawed, and created more confusion on the political level in the international organization, that it actually created functioned as a driver for moving forward the agenda within the organizations. We have very little systematic research. And again, I think it's also about, this has not been considered a topic within the defense organization. It has not been considered a topic within the ministries of defense, because if it had been that, they would have given funding in order to investigate the implication, the costs of seeing massive destruction of cultural property in the context of armed conflict. Plenty of studies has been made on, harm to civilians and damage to infrastructure and so on and so forth, but nothing on cultural property. All very kind of advocacy based, and it's all in the spirit of creating attention towards it rather than looking at it from a critical perspective.
Next we have Derek.
Thank you. Thanks. I think I'm probably a little more sympathetic to the structure of the paper than Helen is, but I do excuse me. I do take your what you just said about the necessity of doing more ethnographic work and more work on the consequences of destroying cultural property. I wasn't sort of meta-ethical question really. I wasn't sure whether you were saying that. You said something like, in getting a grip on the value of cultural property, we need to do ethnographical fieldwork. We need to ask people what they value. And in getting a grip on the proportionality calculations, we need to know the consequences of destroying cultural property. And let's say we knew all that. That's still going to lead. I don't think that's still going to leave something out. So I take if the strategy is something like this, thinking directly about the value of cultural property, we're not going to get anywhere. So what we need to do is we need to go indirectly and ask people why they value. Then if you go back to your Serbian Orthodox priest and his 14th century church, the reason it's valuable to him is not because he values it or his culture values it. He values it because it's an important 14th century church. And the reason that he will think that that it's worth investing a lot of resources, whether human harms, etc., not to damage it, is going to be nothing to do with the consequences of damaging it. It's just going to be to do with that he holds it to be of a certain value, such that it's comparable to. So looked at from the perspective of the people who value the property themselves, that's going to be they're going to hold it as their conception of the value of it is not going to be reducible to the alternatives that you offer us. It looks as if in the conversation we're still going to need some conception of why they value it, rather than just that they value it.
Yeah. Which makes it complicated also because, I mean, Father Sava in the monastery in Kosovo, I mean, the key value of the monastery and the church for the community of monks here is to sustain the everyday practices of worshiping. And from a cynical perspective, I mean, that was kind of my point with ascribing value. The question is whether it would, what kind of harm it would do to in this case, the Serbian Orthodox Church as such, if they lose the Dečani monastery. Maybe it could even strengthen the religious community. I mean, it's just kind of a hypothetical thought, right? Just because they say that their community would not sustain a situation where the Dečani monastery was razed to the ground. But maybe they would. Maybe they could have new vineyards and a new kind of a geography for the religious practices placed somewhere else. And how would we then assess the value? I mean, from the kind of objective perspective of moral philosophy in the context of warfare.
Yeah, I mean, it seems this. It would be good to know that, and I agree with you. That must be right and interesting. I wonder whether we can do without just. I mean, just mindful of what you said earlier when you were asking me a question that this is whatever it was, a 14th century monastery. Empires come and go, but this monastery has remained. Whether that in its, so if you said to them, look, I can give you a plastic monastery now, and you'll find out that in fact your community will be stronger and the services will go on before, as before. My hunch is they're not going to, that the thought that it's a 14th century monastery has got something just irreducibly to do with it, rather than just simply that.
So we think.
Yeah,
that's our belief, right?
Yeah.
And in Japan, I mean, the approach would perhaps be different. And what does that do to moral philosophy, right? That's my question. And the question is, I mean, maybe I'm probably reducing. This is my first intervention where I kind of use the concept of just war theory to pitch an argument. But it is very much these challenges that the military operational level are faced with when they're sitting in the room and just like, what should we do with cultural property? What the hell is this 54 convention all about, right? That's a thing. What is the value, you know? Because it's, I mean, one of the reasons why NATO is still in Kosovo is because of the monastery. Or it's because of the World Heritage Site. So cultural property is an issue that is waiting to be solved before we pull out from Kosovo as an alliance. It's very expensive to have enormous military space and all this kind of thing. So there is also, maybe not a life and death, but there still is a proportionality assessment built into the decision to keep NATO forces on the ground in Kosovo.
Cool.
And
Yeah.
I just don't know how to pin it down in a way that we can use it to elaborate argument from the perspective of moral philosophy.
Yeah, no, it's interesting.
Next on the list is Massimo.
So I was wondering if you could say a bit more about this issue of how we can identify cultural property. How to identify cultural property. So something you mentioned is that we need, one way to go would be to conduct these ethnographic studies, and then you appeal to something even more subjective, in a sense, this notion of collective emotions. And while it seems plausible that this might be part of the story, we might worry about this being the whole story. Right? So imagine that after 8 years of Trump, people in the US just think that there really is not much value in preserving lots of museums and the Guggenheim and so on and so forth. But we really need to make sure that in case of an emergency, all the KFCs are protected, because that's what people really care about. It seems that by itself doesn't give us reason to protect, certainly not overriding reasons to take what people think at face value and protect the KFCs instead of protecting the Guggenheim Award. Right, so assuming that this intuition is correct, which I hope it is, it seems that just looking at it seems that there should be a larger role for the sort of a more kind of ontological inquiry about what the value of certain artifacts or certain works of art is, and you don't find the answer to that question just by asking people what they think. Maybe that's what you meant all along. But I was wondering if you could say more about that, because what you stressed was this subjective dimension of the picture that has to do with, again, conducting ethnographic studies and so on.
I'm just comparing it to moralizing about taking lives, which I still think, and I have to sort out that with Hill, and I think we agree, but it's just a matter of concepts about this kind of assumed equality of human lives that lies beneath as a fundamental ontology of elaborating moral arguments about when it is permissible or not to take lives or risk other lives. And my only point is just that we are used to that kind of relatively safe ground when we are philosophizing about the use of armed force in the context of war. And when we then are prevented with a protection regime as a 1954 regime and its protocols, as well as on additional clauses within the laws of war that applies to and regulates cultural property in war, we are suddenly faced with an object which is fundamentally heterogeneous. At least, I mean, if we go by the dominant accounts within heritage literature, which is increasingly emphasizing local ownership as a way to go in order to identify what counts as cultural property or not. And to go down that avenue, I mean, is the local ownership avenue, will always lead us to a place where we need to ask people. I mean, it would be an empirical exercise, because in the end of that road, you will have human beings sitting, standing, moving around, using objects or sites that have a special, what we call cultural value for them, and that needs to be assessed in terms of having cultural property value. But the local ownership paradigm, which is very dominant within heritage discourse today, it allows us to identify cultural property side by use of indicators, but then again to establish a more accurate value, which can be used in order to inform decision takers within, for instance, defense organization. I think there is a long way, and that was only kind of the distinction or the tension or the challenge that I was seeking to point at when I raised this question of the radical impossibility of defining a priori what counts as cultural property, what does not count as cultural property, when we have at least a fairly solid fundamental to identify what counts as a human being, what does not count as a human being on a distance.
The question of local ownership versus other kind of stakeholders, it's separate from the question of how you establish the value of a cultural artifact or even a human being, right? So someone could say there's, the relevant stakeholders, the relevant stakeholder is the local political community, and outsiders don't have a say in establishing what should happen to this temple or whatever. But that's not something that we find out by asking the locals. It's something that you think about and you come up with good theories that support this view or not. So there is a question that has to do with who has a say in deciding what should happen over the relevant artifacts or work of art. And then there is the question of how you arrive to this conclusion.
Yes.
I'm interested in the second question. And this is the question that you answer in a sort of a procedural way, which was you conduct these ethnographic studies, we go and ask people, what do you think about preserving this temple versus saving lives? And I just think about my silly example about, people preferring to preserve KFCs over preserving the Guggenheim. When someone comes up with such a silly, if a political community comes up with such a silly conclusion, we should disregard that conclusion. Then perhaps if they come up with some silly conclusion about how to trade off human lives and works of art, then we should disregard their conclusion in the second case as well. So the whole point here is that your answer to the procedural question seems to me too strong in that it leaves it open for the political community to assign value to human lives and cultural artifacts whichever way they want, and I worry about that.
Not to assign value to human life, but to assign value to cultural property. And yes, I take a point. I mean, maybe the concept of local ownership should be qualified a little bit more and should have involved stakeholder communities or expert communities. It's just the challenge is to identify who's got to say. I mean, where is the relation between human beings and the object in question? Because alone the object is nothing. is only through its relation to human beings or human beings' relation to the object that the object may constitute an object regulated by international law and perhaps also constitute an object that is relevant for more philosophy to consider. But on the procedural steps, I don't know, and I think this is obviously one of the huge challenges that we are faced with. And on the one hand, we know when we see cultural property, but to arrive at not only an estimate but a more exact value to compare objects against each other. I mean, should we save this object or that object? I mean, that could also be the equation. How do we do that? And there is no methodology. There is no procedural steps agreed by the international community in order to establish that kind of value. Yeah.
I think we're sort of nearly out of time now. Is your finger very, very quick?
Yes,
And then there's one more question from Christina, and then we
On
probably
this,
should
just
start.
very, so I just when you said to Massimo, no, they wouldn't assign value to human beings, I had precisely this worry that they might well, though, would your view allow them to assign the comparative value? Because one of the things they're asking is not just how much do you care about this, but how much do you care about this compared to other things? And so you say to them, well, what would you rather protect, the site or the hospital? Now, if you say the site, you are assigning comparative values to human beings. So this, I mean, would the kind of study you're proposing allow local stakeholders to decide, in effect, the comparative value of human lives? Because they get to say, save the site, don't save the hospital.
I don't know. And so I'm not proposing a methodology. I'm just pointing, towards the only possible way of actually establishing the value for moral consideration would be to involve with stakeholder communities. At least if we go by the dominant discourse that is kind of accepted by the international community when it comes to identifying cultural property. So that's the only thing I'm saying. I mean, going down that line, I don't know where. I mean, that's a Pandora's box. I mean, maybe a little bit hope on the bottom, but it's just different, and it's just. But it is that exercise, it's that methodology, it's that concept that needs to be elaborated, also for military commanders to have as a tool, and what you see instead is that. The kind of, let's call it the global heritage community is always insisting that military defense organizations, they need experts because this is such a complicated matter. That's what in that argument. As you need a certain expertise, it always needs to be a kind of extra human in order to be able to assess cultural property as a part of the military geography. But methodological-wise, it's very weak. I mean, what to actually propose in terms of what should then be done. What can they offer defense organizations?
So we are into lunch now. There was one more question from Christina.
Take Christina's question.
What do you think that, yes, it's a question. What do you think that the Ministry of Culture of each state they do? What do you think UNESCO is doing? What do you think the NGOs, so which represent the local society and the civil society, what do you think all those people do when you say there is no methodology in defining what cultural heritage is?
I don't think they have a methodology. I haven't seen any method. I mean, we need an agreed, but please send it to me, and I would be very interested in draft paper. I'm not saying that we don't have it. Yeah.
With the definition of heritage,
Yeah.
because you say there is no methodology to define cultural property. And what about, for example, the different conventions and the fact that if you see the evolution of the conventions. Last one, which is something which is not new in the field of
Exactly.
heritage, but has been a need, specific need in 2003 dealing with intangible heritage, which are more linked with the issue of protecting things that are not material, protecting things that are not so evidently conceived as heritage. Okay, but this has been a long process. I was involved in this process, and it took 20 years or more. But it doesn't mean that before this concept was not there. It has been a process just to find a way, and the way was chosen not by me, and for the whole community participated in this, but to have a convention, at least in order to try to protect this heritage that was not included in the World Heritage Convention or in the 1954 or in 1970 Convention or the previous conventions. So I think that all these instruments, which are legal instruments, serve together with the role of the ministries of culture. In some countries they are put differently, but they do the same thing, and also with the local, international NGOs dealing with protection of heritage, and with the civil society, local NGOs, international NGOs. All those people and instruments, they do what you say. I mean, they define what cultural property is at international level and at local level. And the more you deal with local people, local agencies, NGOs or whatever, the more you have a local idea of what project is in this place. So, if you speak about methodology, we should perhaps discuss what is methodology for you, because I don't see there is a lack of methodology in defining in the heritage wall.
In the more generally viewed, yeah.
For me, it is then to insight.
I think so.
Yeah,
Because
it doesn't exist.
no, I'm not saying that it's not existing.
It doesn't
Yeah.
because there is a lack of methodology in defining what cultural heritage is. I think there is, for sure there is.
But
And I was explaining to you that there are a lot of instruments and entities and people
yeah.
taking care of this.
Yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I totally agree with it. There's two questions. I mean, the first is whether an object identified by the Ministry of Culture as an object of cultural heritage also makes it an object of relevance for moral philosophy to consider, right? Because there can be all kinds of reasons, and we also know how. I mean and important, I mean, also when you look at World Heritage Sites and this kind of thing, I mean, there's a lot of money and economy involved in designating sites and making them alive and all that kind of things. So there's all kinds of rationalities that are running in the system when it comes to identifying the value of cultural heritage. So the question just, can we take those definitions and move them into moral philosophy, right? And the next thing about No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
When you see, let's say, a piece of heritage that we can all agree is a piece of heritage, like, I don't know, take one.
Yeah.
Take one. If we all agree it's a site, it's a heritage site. From which perspective the moral philosophy is thinking about this?
Okay, so the perspective, the perspective will be, as has been suggested by some, would it be necessary in order to protect the enormous value of that site to deploy soldiers, to deploy international protection in the form of military protection to that site, knowing also that deploying such protection would attract friendly fire instantly, it would attract flows of refugees, it would create a new situation on the ground. So there would be all kinds of parameters to consider before that you deploy troops to protect a site as Palmyra. So how can we assess the value of the site of Palmyra compared to the cost and possibly also cost to human life of deploying military protection to that particular site. That is a kind of a dilemmas that would be relevant to consider, right? And the observation that I also pointed at in the beginning when I was asking why is it that we don't have kind of an elaborated moral philosophy in this topic is that we have very few cases in history where military defense forces actually have been allowed through the status of force agreement to involve to protect cultural property. Yes, we have the case of Mali, Resolution 2001, but it was also, to my knowledge, I mean, to the account of the French deputy ambassador that was part of installing that language in the resolution. The reason for putting it in was not to install a cultural property protection regime in UN peacekeeping, it was to support the International Criminal Court. So you had a different rationality in play here. So I'm just saying that it's very seldom that we actually get to the point even where we have this kind of balances and weighing the risk to soldiers' life compared to an assessed value of a cultural heritage site. But that would be the kind of calculation that would be relevant to consider in the case of Palmyra. And I think we have seen quite a deal of exercise. And I've been a part of an expert team at UNESCO myself, where we were, trying to move around UNESCO's proposal to make the R2P, the responsibility to protect regime, applicable to cultural property, namely to allow that kind of cross-border intervention, military intervention, to protect cultural property. So the discussion had been there, and the question of balancing human lives against the protection of cultural property has been core at these debates. But of course also balancing, the kind of political implications of installing that kind of protective regime while letting people suffer in a humanitarian crisis in the village next to them. So there are all kind of parameters involved into this. But to get back to this, when I'm saying this, that I lack a methodology for assessing identifying cultural property and assessing its relative value. There's nothing as such in the 54 Convention, for instance. It does list a number of topics, but it mentions a museum or a collection or a library. But when is a library? How many books do we need to be in there? How old does these books need to be? What kind of collection does it? All these kind of things. And my point is just that for elaborating moral theorizing on, for instance, the moral value of a library vis-a-vis the cost of human life of protecting it, we would not be able to derive from one case about one library in one village in Syria and the proportionality assessment analysis was made there and apply them to another case, because the next case would be radically different. So the only way I see to go about this is to make kind of we're talking about relative value here, like a case-by-case assessment. And that kind of case-by-case assessment is not provided for in the 54 Convention, and this is also why, for instance, Roger O'Keefe and others, and I was a part of that team as well that reviewed that military manual, trying to figure out, what should you look for? What should you? So that.
I'm sorry, I think we need to stop the lunch.
Oh, we can continue. Yeah.
We can continue over lunch, but I'm hungry.
So.
Dank, Frederik. Okay.
Thanks for listening to my baby steps in moral philosophy. See you next year.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yeah.